Timothy Ronk. The night before he was arrested, Timothy Ronk sent a text message to a woman he had met online in Florida. He told her he was loading up and coming to see her. What he didn't mention in that text was that his live-in girlfriend was already dead, and the house they shared was still burning down around her body. Michelle Lynn Crate was 37 years old. She had moved from Michigan to Mississippi earlier that year to be with Ronk. She had taken him into her home in the small wool market community near Biloxi, and on August 26, 2008, she paid for that decision with her life. Firefighters called to the scene found her remains in a bedroom, burned nearly to the bone. The autopsy would eventually reveal that she had been stabbed multiple times in the back before the fire was ever set. But she also had carbon monoxide in her system, which told investigators something important. She was still alive when the flames reached her. By the next morning, Ronk was in Jacksonville, Florida, walking out of a department store with the woman from the text messages, a woman named Heather Hindle. 2 U.S. Marshals were already waiting for him in the parking lot. A knife was recovered from his vehicle, though DNA testing on it later came back negative. He was arrested on the spot and eventually charged with capital murder and armed robbery. The trial took place in Harrison County in 2010. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Allison Baker and Assistant District Attorney Chris Schmidt. Baker delivered what became one of the more quoted closing arguments in recent Mississippi death penalty history. She told the jurors, in essence, that Michelle had taken Ronk in and Ronk had taken her out. She told them they were not the ones taking Timothy Ronk's life. Ronk had forfeited his life on August 26, 2008. The defense was led by Eric Geiss. He tried to argue that this was not technically capital murder. He told the jury that the arson was a separate cover-up act, not part of the killing itself, and he raised a bipolar diagnosis that Ronk had been carrying for years. Geiss said Ronk was not insane. He was just, in that specific moment, incapable of making a rational decision. The jury did not buy it. Ronk was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, plus 30 years for the armed robbery, and he was shipped to Parchman. And then the appeals started, the way they always do. The Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and sentence in 2015. Post-conviction relief was denied in 2019. A second round of post-conviction relief was denied in 2024, after the Mississippi Supreme Court quietly overruled an earlier precedent called Grayson, a case that had briefly allowed prisoners to raise ineffective post-conviction counsel claims. Without Grayson, that door slammed shut for Ronk. The U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition on January 21, 2025. The headline on WLOX the next morning read, in plain language, that the Biloxi man would remain on death row. As of today, that's still true. Timothy Ronk is at Parchman. No execution date has been set. He is one of roughly 34 men still living on Mississippi's death row, most of them held inside a housing block called Unit 29, a place the state's own House Corrections Chair has described in recent testimony as uninhabitable for years. We'll come back to Unit 29 before this is over. But if you thought Ronk's timing was cold, calling another woman on the same morning he lit his girlfriend's body on fire, wait until you hear about the man who committed a fresh capital murder 4 days before he was supposed to stand trial for a completely different one. Charles Ray Crawford. On January 29, 1993, Charles Ray Crawford was exactly 4 days away from standing trial in a Mississippi courtroom on charges from an earlier crime. That's not a typo, by the way. 4 days. The charges against him in that earlier case were serious. Prosecutors alleged that in 1991 he had committed a violent sexual assault against a 17-year-old girl, and that he had attacked her friend during the same incident. Court records described the investigation of that case as staggering in scope, and the physical evidence tying Crawford to it was overwhelming. He was, by any reasonable reading of the file, about to lose the rest of his life to a prison sentence. So instead of waiting for that trial, he committed another crime first. Christy Denise Ray was 20 years old. She had been born in Germany and moved with her family to Mississippi as a child. She was studying at Northeast Mississippi Community College while working part-time at the same local bank where her mother worked. She was, by every account of everyone who knew her, exactly the kind of young woman a small town describes as bright, quiet, and going somewhere. She had no relationship with Charles Ray Crawford, none at all. She was chosen because she was there. Crawford broke into the Ray family home in Chalabete, Tippah County, intending to burglarize it. When Christy walked in on him, he kidnapped her. He then left behind a ransom note assembled from magazine cutouts, the sort of thing you would expect to see in a bad crime movie. Investigators would later recover the leftover magazine pieces from the attic of his former father-in-law's house. He drove Christy to a secluded barn, where he handcuffed her, raped her, and then stabbed her in the chest. When police first brought him in, Crawford claimed he had suffered a blackout and could not remember what had happened. Then he changed his story. He said he must have killed her, and he led officers to her body. That, apparently, was his version of a confession. The trial was moved on a change of venue to Lafayette County. On April 22, 1994, a jury convicted Crawford of capital murder, sexual battery, burglary, and rape. The following day, the same jury sentenced him to death. His prior conviction from the 1991 case was introduced as an aggravating factor. A prison psychiatrist testified that Crawford suffered from bipolar disorder and memory loss. A rebuttal psychologist testified that Crawford had no such diagnosis and that everything about the crime pointed to careful premeditation. Crawford went to Parchman, where he stayed for over 3 decades. His appeals ran every possible track. The Mississippi Supreme Court dismissed his direct appeal in 1998. The Fifth Circuit upheld his conviction in 2013. And in 2025, the United States Supreme Court denied his final petition, but not before a striking dissent. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, wrote that Crawford's own lawyers had failed to listen to him. She said this was not because they misunderstood their client, but because they chose not to. The dissent invoked a 2018 decision called McCoy v. Louisiana, which protects a defendant's constitutional right to maintain his innocence even against his own attorney's strategy. It wasn't enough. Mississippi's Office of Capital Post-Conviction Counsel later said publicly that Crawford was executed without ever receiving the fair trial that all Americans are guaranteed. Governor Tate Reeves denied clemency. On October 15, 2025, Crawford was strapped to a gurney inside the execution chamber at Parchman. Before the drugs were administered, he spoke to Christy Ray's family and told them that real closure and real peace could not be reached without God. He was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m., the second Mississippi execution of the year. The first execution of 2025 had come just under 4 months earlier, and it belonged to a man who had been sitting on that same death row since Gerald Ford was president. Richard Gerald Jordan. Richard Gerald Jordan spent 49 years on death row at Parchman before Mississippi finally executed him. He arrived when Jimmy Carter was campaigning for the White House, and he did not leave until Donald Trump was in the middle of his second term. By the time the state finally executed him, he was Mississippi's oldest death row inmate and its longest-serving one. Several of the correctional officers assigned to him had not been born when he was first sentenced. He was also a Vietnam veteran. He came home from that war with what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, though nobody used that phrase in 1976. His victim was Edwina Martyr. She was 34 years old, a mother of 2 boys, and the wife of a commercial loan officer named Charles Martyr, who everyone called Chuck. Chuck worked at Gulf National Bank in Gulfport, Mississippi. In January of 1976, Jordan was unemployed and desperate for money. He came up with a plan that on paper sounded almost simple. He phoned the bank and asked to speak to a loan officer just to get a name. He was given Chuck Martyr's. He then opened a phone book, looked up the Martyr home address, and drove there. Edwina was the one who answered the door. Jordan kidnapped her, drove her out into the DeSoto National Forest, and shot her in the back of the head. Prosecutors would later argue this was an execution. Jordan's defense claimed she was shot as she tried to run away. Either way, she was dead, and her killer was not finished. Jordan drove back into town, called Chuck Martyr at the bank, and told him Edwina was still alive. He then demanded a $25,000 ransom. There were 2 failed ransom drops before police finally caught up to him. What followed was one of the longest legal sagas in Mississippi history. Jordan was sentenced to death in 1976. Then he was resentenced. Then he was tried again. Then he was resentenced again. Mississippi's death penalty statute kept changing under his feet, and he kept getting hauled back into court. He was formally sentenced to death for the 4th and final time in 1998. Decades of federal appeals followed. You would think somewhere in that time somebody would have said something. Nobody did. Jordan was still on death row in 2025 when a federal lawsuit challenging Mississippi's 3-drug lethal injection protocol, which relies on a controversial sedative called midazolam, was quietly stayed by U.S. District Judge Henry Wingate in March. Jordan was one of the 2 lead plaintiffs in that lawsuit. The other was a man we will get to later in this video, named Ricky Chase. Both of them had spent decades arguing that midazolam does not adequately anesthetize a prisoner before the paralytic and heart-stopping drugs are administered. The lawsuit was not resolved before Jordan's execution date arrived. It simply sat there. On June 25, 2025, Jordan was brought into the death chamber. Superintendent Mark McClure later told reporters that Jordan spent the day talking to staff and telling stories from his life. His last meal was chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. His final words were an apology to the Martyr family and a thank you to everyone involved for what he called a humane way of doing this. He said he would see them on the other side. He was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. The Martyr family issued a statement, read on their behalf by Edwina's nephew, Keith DeGroy. In it, they said that nothing would bring back their mother, sister, and friend, and that nothing could ever change what Jordan took from them 49 years earlier. Jordan was the longest-serving inmate on this list. The next one lasted only 16 years. But what he did in 1996, and what he did with a set of butcher knives after the killing, is still, to this day, the kind of case that makes Mississippi corrections officers uncomfortable talking about it in a room. Gary Carl Simmons, Jr. Gary Carl Simmons, Jr. worked as a grocery store butcher, a detail that is going to matter before this case is over. In August of 1996, a 21-year-old man named Jeffrey Wolf drove from Houston, Texas to Pascagoula, Mississippi to collect on a drug debt. Estimates of that debt run somewhere between $12,000 and $20,000. Wolf brought along an 18-year-old companion, a young woman named Charlene Leeser. They arrived at Simmons's home together expecting a straightforward payment. That is not what happened. Simmons had brought in an accomplice for the meeting, a former brother-in-law of his named Timothy Milano. As Wolf stepped inside, Milano shot him with a .22 caliber rifle. Wolf was killed almost immediately, and then Simmons turned his attention to Lisa. He hogtied her. He locked her inside a footlocker in his home. Later that night, he removed her from the box, brought her into a bedroom, and raped her. Court testimony later revealed he told her, during the assault, that her life depended on how well she performed. He then put her back into the footlocker and closed the lid. And somehow, it gets worse. While Charlene Leeser was still alive and locked inside that box, Gary Simmons took Jeffrey Wolf's body into his bathroom. Then, using butcher knives and a bolt cutter, both tools he was intimately familiar with from his day job, he dismembered and gutted Wolf's remains. He then drove the pieces out to a bayou infested with alligators and scattered them across the water. The next morning, Charlene Leeser managed to force open the footlocker from the inside. She ran to a neighbor's house and called the police. When officers arrived at Simmons's home, they found bloody buckets in the bathroom and body parts elsewhere on the property. It was the kind of crime scene that veteran investigators told reporters they had never seen before. Simmons was convicted in August of 1997 of capital murder, kidnapping, and rape. He was sentenced to death plus 2 life terms. Milano, the accomplice who fired the shot, received life for the capital murder and 30 additional years for the kidnapping. The rape charge against Milano was dismissed. That legal outcome, in which the man who actually pulled the trigger got life while the man who dismembered the body got death, has been debated by Mississippi legal scholars ever since. The 2 aggravating factors submitted to the jury were that Simmons knowingly created a great risk of death to many people, and that the killing was committed for pecuniary gain during the course of a robbery. The state introduced 46 pieces of evidence at trial, including the knife and a bush hook. Simmons then went to Parchman and stayed there for the next 15 years. On June 20, 2012, he was strapped to a gurney inside the execution chamber. His final statement was that he had been blessed to be loved by some good people, by some amazing people. He was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. Jeffrey Wolf's father, Pascal Lee Wolf, watched the entire execution from the witness room. He wore a John Deere cap and a camouflage shirt. Afterward, he told reporters exactly what he thought of Simmons. He called him, in blunt terms, a piece of trash who was going to burn in hell, and he said he was going to go home and have himself a cold beer. That execution was the 6th Mississippi execution of 2012. It was the most the state had carried out in a single year since the 1950s. Mississippi Department of Corrections Commissioner Chris Epps told the press, after the fact, that for the 3rd time that month, the cause of justice had been championed. Simmons was, by consensus among the reporters who covered him, one of the more disturbing men to occupy Parchman's death row. But he was not the only inmate on this list, whose crime involved a robbery inside a small business. 2 years before Simmons and Milano ambushed those 2 Texans in Pascagoula, a man named Joseph Daniel Burns walked into a motel in Tupelo, sat down with the manager to help him count the day's cash, and pulled out 3 separate weapons. Joseph Daniel Burns. The manager of the Townhouse Motel in Tupelo, Mississippi, was a man named Floyd Melvin McBride. Everyone called him Mike. He lived in a small residence attached to the motel office, which meant he was essentially always at work. On the night of November 10, 1994, 2 men walked into that office. One of them, an acquaintance of McBride's named Philip Hale, sat down with Mike to help him count the cash from the day's rentals. The other man was Joseph Daniel Burns. Burns went by Jojo. He was 26 years old and had spent time in prison before. According to Hale, who later testified against him, the two of them had already decided to rob McBride before they ever walked through the door. Hale hit McBride first, knocking him to the floor. Then Hale walked into an adjoining room. When he returned, Burns was still going, but not with his fists. Burns was, at that point, attacking Mike McBride with a knife, a screwdriver, and a fork. And no, I'm not making that up. The state's evidence at trial, including Hale's own testimony, identified all three tools. Mike McBride was beaten and stabbed until he bled to death on the floor of his own motel office. The money box was pried open. According to Hale, Burns told him afterward that he had killed McBride specifically so there would be no witnesses, so he could not be identified, and so he would not have to go back to the penitentiary. For months, the case went unsolved. Then anonymous tips began coming into the Lee County Sheriff's Department, and Philip Hale eventually flipped. Burns was convicted of capital murder in 1996. The jury found all four required intent elements and the robbery aggravator. Philip Hale, the accomplice, received a life sentence and was later paroled on December 1, 2008. Burns went to Parchman and spent the next 14 years there fighting his sentence. He came very close, at the end, to running out the clock on his own execution. His attorneys were still filing last-minute motions in the days before his death date. Mississippi Attorney General Jim Hood publicly complained that Burns was attempting, by any means available, to delay the execution through the sheer tardiness of his filings. Governor Haley Barbour denied clemency and made a point of saying he would not substitute his judgment for that of the courts, which had considered the matter for years. On July 21, 2010, Burns was brought into the death chamber. What happened next was, by the accounts of the reporters in the witness room, unusual. Burns turned to Mike McBride's sister, a woman named Kay Gordon, who had come to watch the execution. He apologized to her. He asked her to forgive him, adding that he was not asking for his own sake but for hers. Then, still strapped to the gurney and with the intravenous line already in place, he began reciting the 23rd Psalm from memory. He recited it all the way through, the entire prayer. After the final line, he added a single sentence of his own. He said the family could believe those words because that was where he was going. Burns was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. It was the third Mississippi execution of 2010. His case on its face looked like the most ordinary crime on this list. A motel robbery gone wrong. A stack of cash counted at the wrong hour of the night. But the specific details of what happened inside that office, the three separate implements found near Mike McBride's body, and the fact that Burns's final moments alive on this planet were spent reciting scripture to the sister of the man he had killed, have kept his case in Mississippi true crime writing for the last 15 years. If you're enjoying this so far and you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time to hit that button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you these cases. Blade Grayson. In December of 2021, a handwritten letter arrived at the Mississippi Supreme Court. It had been written from a cell at Parchman by a death row inmate named Blade Nathaniel Grayson. In the letter, Grayson asked the court to please, with all expedients, carry out his own execution. He wrote that he was formally dropping every remaining appeal. He said his family, the victim's family, and he himself had all waited more than 25 years for this, and it was time. Less than 4 months later, he changed his mind. Minnie Smith was 78 years old. She lived alone in a small home in George County, Mississippi, out near the Pascagoula River. Her son-in-law was the one who discovered her body on May 5, 1996. She had been killed in her own bed. The autopsy documented the full scale of the attack. Minnie Smith had been stabbed more than 30 times. She also had blunt force trauma to her body and clear defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which meant she had understood what was happening and had tried to fight back against a much larger, much younger man. That man was Blade Grayson. He was 19 years old. He lived close by. He had a string of prior local burglary convictions, and according to trial testimony, he had entered Minnie Smith's home that night intending to steal a firearm. When she woke up, he killed her. He was arrested a short time later across the state line in Escambia County, Florida. At first, he tried to blame the whole thing on an accomplice, a man named Jason Kilpatrick. Then, investigators put him on a polygraph. He failed it. On videotape, he confessed. He then led officers to the murder weapon and to a stolen checkbook taken from the home. In August of 1997, a George County jury convicted Grayson of capital murder and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. The Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed that sentence in 2001. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear his case in 2005, and then he sat. For 16 years, he sat. By December of 2021, Grayson had, in his own words, had enough. He wrote the letter. In simpler terms, he was asking the state to please just kill him already so everyone involved could move on. His original trial attorney, a man named David Ishii, who had since become a justice on the Mississippi Supreme Court and had to recuse from the case, publicly acknowledged that his former client was making a legal choice. Given the option between death and life without parole, Ishii said, it was Grayson's option to choose. The Mississippi Supreme Court did not allow it. They ruled that Grayson could not unilaterally waive his own appeals, and they ordered a full competency hearing back in the trial court. That hearing produced the reversal. In an order dated April 11, 2022, Grayson told George County Circuit Judge Kathy King Jackson, on the record and under oath, that he had changed his mind. He no longer wanted the state to kill him. He wanted to keep appealing. As of the recording of this video, he is still at Parchman. No execution date has been set. He is one of the men held in Unit 29, the same housing block that state investigators have described as running with mold, rodents, and cell temperatures that in the summer months have been documented past 140 degrees. And he is, at the time of this recording, still filing appeals. But Grayson was not the only Mississippi death row inmate to publicly flip on his own execution decision. The sixth inmate on this list asked to drop his appeals, then changed his mind, and then dropped them again, all inside the same calendar year. Unlike Grayson, he actually did face the gurney. Bobby Glenn Wilcher. Katie Bell Moore was 45 years old. Velma Odell Noblin was another mother from the same small community in Scott County, Mississippi. On the night of March 5, 1982, both women were closing out an evening together at a bar in the town of Forest. Just before midnight, a 19-year-old drifter walked over to their table and asked for a ride home. They said yes. They never made it home. Bobby Glenn Wilcher directed the two women down a series of increasingly rural roads until they were driving through the Bienville National Forest, on a dirt track no reasonable person would have called a shortcut. Somewhere on that muddy stretch of road, Wilcher stabbed both of them more than 20 times each. Their bodies were later found along the banks of that same road, still soaked through with blood, in a way that the responding crime scene coroner told reporters he would never be able to forget. That crime scene coroner was a man named Joe Rigby. He was also Katie Moore's nephew. He would speak publicly about the case for the next 24 years. Wiltshire was arrested quickly. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1984. Then, after a technical issue on appeal, he was tried again in 1994 and resentenced to death a second time. On paper, that was the end of the case. In practice, it was only the beginning of one of the strangest legal sagas in Mississippi death penalty history. Wiltshire suffered from severe bipolar disorder. He had a long, documented history of suicide attempts going back to his early 20s. In 2006, 24 years into his time at Parchman, he informed his attorneys that he was done fighting. He wanted every remaining appeal dropped, and he wanted to be executed as soon as the state could schedule it. Then he changed his mind and asked them to file everything back. Then he changed his mind a second time and asked them to withdraw everything again. You would think somewhere in that process, somebody in the legal system would have said something. Nobody did. In July of 2006, the United States Supreme Court granted him a last-minute stay of execution to sort out whether he was mentally competent to make that decision at all. The stay held for a few months. Then the courts decided he was competent enough, and the execution was rescheduled. On October 18, 2006, Wiltshire was brought into the death chamber at Parchman. When the warden asked him if he had any last words, he answered with two of them. He said he had none. At Wiltshire's own written request, no member of his own family was present. The lethal injection took approximately 11 minutes. He was pronounced dead at 6:42 p.m. Outside the prison, Joe Rigby spoke to the reporters gathered in the parking lot. He said the families of Katie Moore and Odell Noblin were relieved that this day had finally come after 24 years, and that they were hoping it would bring them some kind of closure. Governor Haley Barbour issued a written statement of his own, and in it he made a point he would return to for the rest of his tenure. The only injustice, Barbour said, was that 24 years had already passed since Wiltshire had earned the death penalty. Mississippi Department of Corrections Commissioner Chris Epps offered the phrase he used again and again in those years, that the cause of justice had championed over wrong. Wiltshire was the first inmate on this list to be executed at Parchman. At the time of his death, he was 43 years old. He had been arrested for the murders when he was still 19. He had spent, in effect, more than half of his entire life on Mississippi's death row, waiting on the gurney that eventually came for him. The seventh inmate on this list involves a 19-year-old victim, not a 19-year-old perpetrator. She died 4 days before her 19th birthday, and more than 3 decades later, her killer has still not faced that same gurney. Alan Dale Walker. Kanya Rebecca Edwards was 4 days away from her 19th birthday. She lived with her mother Sheila and her grandmother Tilly in Long Beach, Mississippi. She worked at the East China restaurant, and she was, by every account of those who knew her, a young woman whose life had just started to take shape. On September 8, 1990, she went out to a nightclub called the Fiesta Club in Biloxi. She left with 3 people she believed she could trust for a ride: a young man named Alan Dale Walker, his girlfriend Trina Perry, and a second young man named Jason Reiser. She never came home. Kanya's grandmother Tilly was the person who eventually found her body. A family friend had come by their home to tell them that Kanya's wallet had turned up abandoned near the Crystal Lake area of Harrison County. Tilly went looking herself, and in the woods near that lake, she found what was left of her granddaughter. Reiser would eventually testify against Walker at trial, and his testimony painted a picture that is difficult to read even in the sanitized language of an appellate opinion. Walker and Reiser had driven Kanya to Crystal Lake and sexually assaulted her. Reiser said the two of them then held Kanya underwater until she died. And after she was dead, Walker went and obtained gasoline, and they burned her body in the woods. And somehow, in the reading of the file, it gets worse. The court record indicates Kanya had fought back for as long as she was physically able to. The trial was moved on a change of venue to Warren County, in Vicksburg. In August of 1991, Walker was convicted of capital murder, forcible rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death, plus 30 consecutive years for the rape charge, plus another 35 consecutive years for the kidnapping. The Mississippi Supreme Court's written opinion on his direct appeal opened with a sentence that most appellate opinions never come close to. The justices wrote in their own official language that they were confronted with the senseless slaying of Kanya Rebecca Edwards, a young teenager who had fought back against her assailants and at other times had cooperated in a vain attempt to avoid being killed. That phrase, a vain attempt, sat in the Mississippi reports for decades. Kanya's mother, Sheila Edwards, has spoken to reporters for years. In her own blunt words, she has said what those men did to her daughter. She has said they had beaten her, drowned her, and mutilated her. She has said it was awful, and she has said she hopes the monster will die because he took her daughter's life, and she does not understand why he should be allowed to keep his. Here is where this case gets more complicated than most. Because as of the recording of this video, Alan Dale Walker has not been executed. He is still, more than 34 years after the killing, alive at Parchman. The appeals in his case have been unusually tangled, even by Mississippi's own standards. In 2013, the Mississippi Supreme Court took the significant step of finding that Walker's post-conviction counsel had been ineffective. The court then remanded the case for a full hearing on whether Walker's original trial counsel had done adequate work presenting mitigation evidence at the sentencing phase. That hearing eventually concluded, and in 2020, the Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed the death sentence a second time. In June of 2021, the United States Supreme Court denied certiorari, closing his final federal appeal. Since then, Walker has simply remained on death row. No execution date has been set. Governor Tate Reeves has not signed a death warrant for him. He is, by the tally used earlier in this video, one of the 5 men on this list still living inside Parchman's Unit 29. Sheila Edwards is still waiting. Every year that passes, she gives another interview asking the state of Mississippi to finally follow through on the sentence a Vicksburg jury handed down in 1991. The 8th case on this list is a very different kind of Parchman inmate. He was not a stranger to his victim. He was his roommate. And the murder weapon, according to the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, had someone else's DNA on the handle. Bobby Batiste. On March 7, 2008, a 28-year-old graduate student named Andreas Galanis walked into a bank in Starkville, Mississippi to check on his account. He noticed that someone had run up more than $4,500 in unauthorized charges on his debit card. He was almost certain he already knew who had done it, his roommate, a man named Bobby Batiste. Andreas told the bank teller that he intended to file a formal police report and press charges. Then he went home to confront Batiste. He never left that apartment alive. Andreas Galanis had been born in Athens, Greece. His family had immigrated to Biloxi, Mississippi. He was studying at Mississippi State University in Starkville, where he lived at the 21 apartments at 1219 Octok Road. His mother, Catherine Galanis, would testify later that Andreas was, in her family's words, the man of the house after his father, the one everyone called for advice, and the family's protector. A family friend, in a statement outside the courthouse, called him an angel. When Andreas failed to board his spring break flight home and his family could not reach him by phone, they alerted the apartment complex. Staff went in and opened his bedroom door, which had been locked from the outside. Andreas was inside, dead on the floor. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Stephen Hain, one of Mississippi's most well-known and later most scrutinized forensic pathologists. Hain documented approximately 36 separate injuries on Andreas's body. Most of them were blunt force trauma to the head and face. Andreas also had defensive wounds on his hands and arms. Bobby Batiste's story, from the moment police brought him in for questioning, was self-defense. He claimed Andreas had attacked him first with a sword that the roommates kept in the apartment as decoration. He admitted to striking Andreas 3 or 4 times, but he insisted the entire encounter had been him defending himself against a much larger, armed roommate. That story fell apart on one specific piece of evidence. The Mississippi Bureau of Investigation had swabbed the handle of the sword. The DNA on that handle did not belong to Andreas Galanis. That's not a typo, by the way. The DNA on the handle of the weapon Batiste claimed Andreas had used to attack him was a female's, not Andreas's, and not Batiste's own. During the trial, District Attorney Forrest Allgood laid the finding out for the jury during the testimony of the DNA analyst. He walked her through the point directly, asking her to confirm one more time that whoever had actually gripped that sword handle had not been Andreas Galanis. She confirmed it. That single exchange was, according to the reporters covering the trial, the moment the self-defense theory died on the courtroom floor. In 2009, an Oktibbeha County jury convicted Bobby Batiste of capital murder with an underlying felony of robbery. He was sentenced to death and shipped to Parchman. The Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and sentence on May 16, 2013. His appeals, however, raised a separate and significant issue. Batiste is black. The jury that convicted him was entirely white. Post-conviction motions alleged that court bailiffs had made improper comments to jurors about the racial makeup of the jury. Comments that Batiste's attorneys argued had contaminated the entire verdict. In January of 2016, the Mississippi Supreme Court granted post-conviction relief on the narrow question of whether such comments had occurred. Justice James Kitchens wrote that affidavits in the record supported Batiste's claim that bailiffs had made improper remarks that affected his right to a fair trial. An evidentiary hearing was ordered in the trial court. That court eventually found that no such comments had ever been made. The Mississippi Supreme Court, on March 3, 2022, affirmed that finding and denied relief. Batiste is still at Parchman today. No execution date has been set for him. He is now one of the men held inside Unit 29, the same housing block where Ronk, Walker, Grayson, and the final inmate on this list are all still alive, still filing appeals, and still waiting. The final case is one of the 2 lead plaintiffs, along with Richard Jordan, on the ongoing federal lawsuit challenging the very lethal injection drugs Mississippi still uses inside that same execution chamber. Jordan did not live to see how that lawsuit ends. The last inmate on this list is still waiting to find out. Ricky Chase. Elmer Hart was a vegetable salesman. He was somewhere between 67 and 70 years old, depending on which court document you happen to be reading. He had been married to his wife Doris for 49 years. They lived together in a rural home on Norman Road, just outside Hazelhurst, Mississippi, in Copiah County. They were, by every account from their neighbors, the kind of people who kept an unlocked back door and knew everybody in town by their first name. On August 14, 1989, Doris Hart was on the family carport when 2 men grabbed her from behind. One of them pressed an ammonia-soaked towel over her face. They tied her hands, blindfolded her, and dragged her back inside her own house. Then they waited for her husband to come home. The two men were Ricky Chase and a co-defendant named Robert Washington. They had believed, based on local gossip, that the Harts kept a large amount of money hidden inside the house. They ransacked every room. They found jewelry. They found a shotgun and 2 rifles. They found $400 in cash inside Doris's purse. They also stayed, because what they wanted next was Elmer. When Elmer Hart pulled into his own driveway and walked into his own house, Ricky Chase and Robert Washington were hiding in the bathroom. Elmer walked into the bedroom, where his wife of 49 years was still tied and blindfolded on the floor. One of the two men fired a single shot. Elmer Hart died on that bedroom floor next to his wife, who could hear everything but could see nothing. Doris Hart survived, and she gave police everything she was able to give them. Chase was arrested. He rode with sheriff's deputies to point out where various pieces of stolen evidence had been hidden across the county. In February of 1990, a Copiah County jury convicted him of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Robert Washington was also convicted. The Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed Chase's sentence in 1994. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case in 1995. Chase, for his part, has never denied being inside that house. What he denies, and what he has consistently denied since the day he was arrested, is that he pulled the trigger. He has said, on the record, in his own plainer words, that he helped tie up Mrs. Hart and helped load the stolen guns into the getaway car. But he says the fatal shot came from Robert Washington, not from him. The state psychologist assigned to his case, a Dr. McVaugh, concluded that Chase had a full-scale IQ of 71, which sits on the border of intellectual disability, but, in the state's view, does not quite cross it. Chase's defense team, currently led by the MacArthur Justice Center and an attorney named James Craig, disagrees. The intellectual disability claim, which would prohibit his execution under a 2002 Supreme Court decision called Atkins v. Virginia, has been raised at every level and denied at every level. Ricky Chase is still at Parchman today. He has now been on Mississippi's death row for more than 35 years, and in early 2025, he took on a legal role that put him in the middle of the last conversation anybody expected. He and Richard Jordan became the two lead plaintiffs on the federal lawsuit challenging Mississippi's 3-drug lethal injection protocol, specifically the use of the sedative midazolam as the initial drug in the sequence. Their attorneys have argued that midazolam, which has been at the center of several documented botched executions in other states, does not fully anesthetize a prisoner before the paralytic and heart-stopping drugs enter the bloodstream. The lawsuit alleges this creates a substantial risk of a torturous death that violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. In March of 2025, U.S. District Judge Henry Wingate stayed that case pending a summary judgment motion. Richard Jordan was executed in June, before the lawsuit could be resolved. Charles Ray Crawford was executed in October. Neither of their deaths gave Ricky Chase the ruling he had been waiting on. And no, I'm not making that up. As of the recording of this video, Chase's own case is still stayed in federal court. His constitutional challenge to the exact drugs the state would use to kill him is unresolved. His execution date has not been set. He is inside Unit 29 at Parchman, in a building that state investigators have documented reaching summer temperatures past 145 degrees Fahrenheit, waiting on a federal court to decide whether the drugs Mississippi keeps in a locked cabinet a few hundred yards away from him are constitutional at all. 10 men, 1 prison, and a system that keeps grinding on with or without answers. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.